Howdy, y'all. America and Canada have been great neighbors a long time. At least President Donald Trump thinks so. In a meeting at the Oval Office on March 13th, he said, "I love Canada. I love the people of Canada. I have many friends in Canada." He also quoted "Oh Canada" more than once in his True Social posts. All that he's suggesting is that we become more than neighbors, that we deepen our friendship and our relationship. Although Chrystia Freeland likes to ignore it, President Donald Trump explicitly said he would never use military force to try to achieve this. During that same meeting, he didn't rule out using military force to assimilate Greenland. In fact, he never offered Greenland to become a state at all. The invitation to become a state carries certain privileges, such as representation in Washington, D.C., and is an offer of generosity. President Donald Trump has repeatedly said that if Canada becomes a state, there will be no more tariffs. But we don't have to take his word for it. The Constitution explicitly prohibits it in Article 1, Sections 9 and 10. One might have expected Canadians to feel honored by this, or to take it as a compliment. However, Canadians are being told his offer to share in greater unity and cooperation is a form of bullying. That Donald Trump's merger is a threat that we must retaliate against. Since perhaps a lot of this misunderstanding comes from not understanding his motives to protect American jobs, correct the trade disparity, fight fentanyl, and address Canadian military underspending, I'd like to address each of these. First of all, fighting fentanyl. No one's going to be able to tell me that there aren't drugs coming through Canada's northern border. I used to work with a man who smuggled drugs through Canada's northern border, and having served 8 years in prison in Washington State, he told me exactly what he did and how he did it. He described to me the hidden compartments, and that was for a drug that's not nearly as concentrated and small as fentanyl that can be fit into hidden compartments even easier. It's important to note that it's not the amount of drugs that are caught at the northern border, but the amount that goes through uncaught that is the problem. And that's not an amount that's recorded or documented anywhere. It's not like these people are filling out import paperwork to declare what they're doing, or that you can go to the Commerce Department to find out the details. But even if the amount of fentanyl that's coming into America through Canada is a small amount, the acceptable rate is 0. Ever since the Liberal Party disbanded Canada's port police in 1997, Canada's ports have been left unprotected and vulnerable to smugglers and organized crime. Many others have written about this in detail, and you can find better information on this by looking up what they said. The rumors on the streets, though, is that when a Surrey longshoreman was murdered in 2015 by a gunman, and there was a later shooting in Richmond at a longshoreman training center in 2009, it was because they opposed the gang activity at the ports. Ultimately, if we give the DEA jurisdiction over our ports too, there'll be much less drugs here. Something that all Canadians should be interested in. Nobody can deny that Canada has a terrible fentanyl problem. And since the Chinese Communist parties are the ones sending the fentanyl here, and it seems natural they would want to partner with other Chinese nationals, because many Chinese immigrants fear the Communist Party, even if they're Canadian citizens. And seeing that there's also many more Chinese people in Canada than in Central and South America, it seems that this is where the drugs are coming through. The Chinese Communist Party regularly takes hostage and murders innocent Canadians. They have not done so to Americans. This is just one more thing that will stop when Canada becomes part of the United States. What better way to push back against Chinese military expansion than to form this union with America? That way, we can fight fentanyl at its true source, not the America-Canada border and not even just Canadian ports, but against Beijing. We can stop the scourge of fentanyl completely if we put enough pressure on Xi Jinping, and partnering with America is the best way to do that. Next, Canadian military underspending. The members of the NATO treaty all agreed in 2006 to each spend 2% of their gross domestic product per year on mutual military defense. While the argument could have been made that each member pay a certain amount per person or per acre of land, all of which would have led to America's benefit, they were generous enough to agree to percent of GDP being the base. Yet even with the favorable terms, almost none of the NATO members kept their agreements. Canada was delinquent by $11 billion the first year and $12 billion the second year, and so forth. On the other hand, Americans overpaid, subsidizing NATO to an average of $340 billion a year more than the agreement. Not to count the lives that were spent as well. This amount certainly would have been smaller had the other members done their part. Yet even if America once again extends grace and doesn't factor in accumulated interest, the average Canadian taxpayer is still $12,000 behind on their payments and has underspent their American counterpart by $48,000 since making the promise 18 years ago. With the militarization of the Arctic by Putin and Xi, Canada has been left completely defenseless and frankly, dependent on America, whether they like to admit it or not. If President Donald Trump were to give Canada a deadline to either pay up or be expelled from NATO, Canadians would realize very quickly what a mistake it was to pick a fight with our greatest ally. Next, the trade disparity. It shouldn't be surprising that an American president would want to protect the jobs of his citizens. The numbers show that Canadians will lose much, much more than Americans if we escalate things. When Donald Trump says that NAFTA was a ripoff of America, it seems at this point that that was just simply an objective fact. It also shouldn't be surprising that Canadian leaders would loathe the idea of the office of the Prime Minister being abolished and replaced with a governorship. Even though it's a much better system for the citizens, it's a much worse system for the politicians. Canadians will have the right to run for US Congress, US Senate, or even President of the United States. But I guess Carney knows he doesn't have the support he'd need to win that race, so you can see why the Canadian leaders want the scam to continue. If Canadians love trading with America so much, then why not become a state? If we don't, then why are we so upset about these tariffs? We can't seriously harm the American economy anyways, and why would we even want to? Canadians should stop the tariff war right now. And we can. But the biggest lie is that this is something Donald Trump wants to impose against Canadians' will. I know someone here in BC who 20 years ago wrote a letter to then real estate investor Donald Trump about how he thought Canada should become part of America. He painted his vision of all the reasons it should happen, and this was long before Trump wanted to get into politics and even before The Apprentice. I don't know if my friend's a Christian, but he believes God must have been at work. A Canadian journalist named Diane Francis published a book in 2013 called Why Canada and America Should Become One Country. Canada will only ever become part of the United States if Canadians want it. That's why I encourage Canadians to consider the merits of the invitation. The US Constitution is much different than the Canadian Constitution. The Founding Fathers of America spent a lot of devotion, thought, debate, and prayer on how to create a great government. They were developing a system to replace the monarchy and wanted to ensure that the new union didn't repeat the failures of the British system they were coming out from under. If you've never done so, I encourage you to read the Declaration of Independence. And when you do, remember that every single signer, and they were unanimous, was signing a document that meant they'd become the enemy of the state for doing so. They were all committing what the British considered to be treason. It's a short document, and from it you can get a deeper understanding of their motives and what exactly was coming against them. The Constitution they later formed has many differences from the Canadian one. The biggest one, of course, is that the Canadian Constitution retains the monarchy and the British system. A very obvious example of the differences is that there's no way someone could ever enter the highest office in the land in America without having a single vote in a general election, like Mark Carney has just done here in Canada. The Founding Fathers had much to say about the perils of letting someone who has been elected to legislate have authority over law enforcement, the military, and foreign diplomacy. If their thoughts are true, Canada will either soon become a state or fall due to corruption. They believed in having a separate executive branch that doesn't participate in Parliament, although it does have the right to veto legislation. They considered this a system of checks and balances that would force each branch to work together with the others if they wanted to get anything done. They brilliantly chose for the nation to have, surprise, a Senate that's elected at the state level. This ensures that every state has an equal say in the federal government, particularly regarding appointing officials and treaty making with foreign entities. We have to understand that although the family line of the King and Queen of England is not exactly its own race, the monarchy system is otherwise a complete form of racism. In it, your genes determine your social status. There's nothing you can do about it. You're either a royal or a peasant. And it's all based on how you were born. In the American system, they stated all men and women are created equal by God. In the Canadian system, it's understood, albeit subtly, that whether you're related to the monarch or not determines your position in society. This is even more pronounced of a bias in those who are, of course, required to swear an oath to the crown. That includes all elected officials, judges, police, other officers, and new citizens. The American citizens are sovereign over their own country. The Canadian people are not. Canadians will have increased sovereignty if we become a state. The Canadian Constitution enforces the idea that the citizens are the serfs of the government, that we elect rulers to reign over us rather than leaders to represent us. Trying to add a form of democracy as a layer on top is not the same as eliminating the erroneous layer. A person is not truly free under the Canadian system. The American Constitution states that laws cannot be passed that infringe on people's freedoms. The Canadian Constitution does not. In America, if the Commander-in-Chief ordered officers to violate citizens' rights under the Bill of Rights, they would have full authority to refuse the order, since they swore an oath to defend and uphold the Constitution. I'll give you an example. When Gavin Newsom tried to shut down Harvest Rock Church in Pasadena, California in 2021 because of a health emergency, allegedly, the Supreme Court of the United States protected the churchgoers, quoting the first article of the Bill of Rights, which reads, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of the people to peaceably assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances." Whereas, when Jason Kenney sent officers to shut down churches in Alberta around the same time, the Canadian courts cited Section 1 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which says, "The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees the freedoms set out in it, subject to reasonable limits prescribed by law that can be demonstrably blah, 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 blah." The Canadian officers claimed that they were only doing their job. My point is that we can expect no less from someone who has taken an oath of allegiance to the King or Queen. The American system is unique. It protects human rights even from the government. All Canadians can agree when we pray, "God, keep our land glorious and free." Thomas Jefferson said in 1809 that Canada should become a state because being under the Constitution was the only way Canadians can have liberty and self-government. President Donald Trump's offer to Canadians is a great one. Lower taxes, better healthcare, safer streets, less drugs, stronger military, representation in Washington, D.C., a bigger, greater, more glorious and free nation than has ever existed on the face of the earth. God bless you.